They were once inseparable childhood sweethearts, until the merciless jaws of war swallowed him whole. 10 years later, she had become a casualty of her family's ruin. He, meanwhile, had risen to become a kingdom alpha, a decisive commander wielding formidable military might. When the old king's envoy arrived at the city gates with 5,000 fully armed royal cavalrymen, issuing a stern demand that he surrender the bride he had stolen, he did not flinch. He did not even draw his sword. Instead, he merely gave a cold, disdainful smile as he sheltered her beneath the broad expanse of his fox fur cloak, then drew back a black iron bow, a weapon powerful enough to pierce through city walls, and issued a declaration to every army in the realm. You wish to take my wife? Then bring me the heads of your 5,000 men in exchange. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The cathedral was freezing despite the hundreds of burning altar candles. Eleanor stood at the high altar like a beautiful sacrificial lamb. Her heavy ivory velvet gown felt like a suffocating burial shroud. She kept her tear-filled eyes firmly locked on the cold stone floor. She absolutely refused to look at the man standing beside her. Lord Henry was a cruel, withered, and ruthless old man. He was infamous throughout the kingdom for breaking his young wives. He had already buried 3 of them. Now, he was using his vast fortune to buy his 4th. Eleanor was breathtakingly beautiful, barely 20, and completely trapped. Her once proud noble family had lost their entire estate in the winter famine. They were drowning in unbearable debt and utter desperation. Henry's heavy chests of gold were the only things that could save them from starvation. Eleanor only had to trade her freedom and her body for their survival. The bitter scent of holy incense in the air was thick and nauseating. The old priest droned on in a monotonous, echoing voice. Henry's bony, ice-cold fingers suddenly gripped Eleanor's delicate wrist. His touch felt like the grasping hand of a corpse. He squeezed her pale skin hard enough to leave dark, ugly bruises. Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood to stop herself from crying. She was only one single heartbeat away from saying the final vow. She was a heartbeat away from signing her soul away forever. Then, the massive oak doors of the sanctuary exploded inward. A violent gust of wind howled wildly through the ancient stone arches. It extinguished 100 candles in a single, terrifying breath. Eleanor froze completely. Her heart began to hammer a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. A thick, suffocating silence immediately fell over the packed cathedral. Every wealthy noble in the kingdom turned their heads toward the ruined entrance. A lone, towering figure stood framed in the shattered doorway. The fading evening sunlight caught the sharp edges of his dark, battle-scarred armor. He wore a heavy crimson cloak that billowed behind him like spilled blood. He stepped slowly into the holy sanctuary. His heavy steel boots struck the stone floor with slow, rhythmic thuds. Eleanor completely stopped breathing. She recognized that determined walk instantly. She knew the impossibly broad set of those powerful shoulders. It was Arthur. But this was not the sweet, gentle boy she remembered. This was not the boy who used to weave her daisy crowns in the summer meadows. This was not the childhood friend who promised to protect her forever. That innocent boy had been sent away to the endless, bloody border wars 10 years ago. The terrifying man walking down the aisle was someone else entirely. He was the supreme commander of the king's royal army. He was the undisputed Duke of the North. He was the absolute alpha of the entire realm. He was a warlord who made arrogant kings tremble and entire empires burn. And his furious, storm-grey eyes were locked dead on Eleanor. "Stop this ceremony at once," Arthur commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that shook the high stained glass windows. It was not a polite request. It was an absolute, unbreakable law. Lord Henry's wrinkled face turned violently red with extreme outrage. "How dare you interrupt a holy union in the house of God?" Henry spat. "Guards! Seize this arrogant fool immediately." A dozen heavily armed royal guards rushed forward with swords drawn. Arthur did not even bother to draw his own weapon. He simply didn't need to. With a brutal, terrifying grace, he dismantled the first four guards in mere seconds. He shattered wrists with his bare, gauntleted hands. He broke knees with effortless, punishing kicks. He moved with the lethal, blinding speed of an apex predator defending its mate. The remaining guards backed away in pure, unadulterated terror. They dropped their heavy steel swords to the floor with loud clatters. No man in his right mind would dare fight the Duke of the North. Arthur continued his slow, deliberate march down the center aisle. He did not break eye contact with Eleanor. Not for a single, fleeting second. His burning gaze was entirely consuming and completely overwhelming. It stripped away all her noble defenses and laid her trembling soul bare. Eleanor shivered violently as he finally reached the marble altar steps. She saw the harsh, unforgiving lines of his strong jaw. She saw the jagged, faded scar crossing over his left eyebrow. He was rugged, wildly handsome, and radiating immense, suffocating power. Lord Henry foolishly tried to step between them to block his path. "She belongs to me, Arthur," Henry barked, though his old voice was shaking with fear. "The marriage contract is already signed by the king." Arthur finally stopped. He looked down at Henry as if the old lord were nothing but a disgusting insect. "A worthless piece of paper," Arthur whispered, his tone deadly soft and chilling. In a blinding flash of movement, Arthur grabbed Lord Henry by the throat. He lifted the older man entirely off the ground with just one hand. The entire cathedral gasped aloud in collective, stunned horror. Arthur casually tossed Lord Henry aside like a broken, useless ragdoll. Henry crashed heavily into the hard stone pews and fell completely unconscious. Eleanor gasped loudly, stepping back until her back hit the cold altar. Arthur turned his intense attention fully back to her. The savage, murderous anger in his eyes suddenly melted into something entirely different. It turned into a dark, deeply possessive hunger that terrified her. "You look absolutely beautiful, my sweet bird," he murmured. His deep voice sent a hot, thrilling shiver straight down her spine. "Arthur," she breathed, hot tears finally springing to her wide eyes. "You actually came back." "I promised you I would," he said, stepping directly into her personal space. He was so incredibly close she could feel the intense heat radiating from his large body. She could smell the masculine scent of leather, cold steel, and fresh rain on him. He reached out slowly and gently brushed a stray golden curl from her wet cheek. His rough touch was surprisingly, heartbreakingly tender. But his firm grip on her chin was absolute, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. "Did you honestly think I would ever let another man claim what is mine?" he asked. His rough thumb slowly stroked across her trembling lower lip. "You promised me your hand when we were 10 years old, Eleanor." She swallowed hard, her pulse racing so fast she felt dizzy. "We were just naive children, Arthur," she whispered brokenly. "Everything has changed now. You have changed." "I survived hell," he corrected her smoothly, his eyes flashing with dark memories. "I conquered entire armies. And I did it all just to come back for you." He leaned in closer, his warm lips brushing intimately against her sensitive ear. "You are not marrying him, or anyone else." "My family," she choked out, a tear finally falling. "They desperately need the gold. I have no other choice." "I possess more gold than the king himself," Arthur replied without hesitation. "Your family's debts are already handled." He wrapped a massive, heavily armored arm tightly around her slender waist. He pulled her flush against the solid, immovable wall of his chest. You belong to me, Eleanor, he declared loudly, ensuring every single person in the cathedral heard his claim. You always have, and you always will. Without waiting for her reply, he scooped her effortlessly up into his strong arms. He carried her directly away from the holy altar. He carried her completely away from her miserable, doomed old life. Eleanor clung helplessly to his incredibly broad shoulders, utterly overwhelmed by his dominance. Her sweet, gentle childhood friend was truly gone forever. In his place stood a ruthless, possessive warlord who would burn the world for her. And he had just openly stolen her in front of the entire kingdom. She knew, in that terrifying but deeply exhilarating moment, that her life would never be the same again. The ultimate alpha had finally returned to claim his long-awaited prize. And he was absolutely never going to let her go. The massive black carriage thundered violently over the cobblestone streets. It was moving incredibly fast, tearing through the dark heart of the capital city. Eleanor was trapped inside, trembling visibly in the dimly lit interior. Outside, a full regiment of heavily armed northern cavalry guarded their rapid escape. But her true captor was sitting right across from her in the shadows. Arthur completely filled the small, velvet-lined space with his imposing presence. He had finally removed his heavy steel helmet. His thick, dark hair was wild and slightly damp with the sweat of exertion. He sat in absolute, terrifying silence, watching her like a hawk watches a cornered dove. His storm-gray eyes missed absolutely nothing. They tracked the rapid, frantic pulse fluttering visibly at the base of her throat. They took in the way her delicate hands gripped the rich velvet cushions in pure panic. Eleanor felt completely exposed beneath his burning, unwavering gaze. She felt like she was suffocating in her heavy, restrictive ivory wedding gown. "Where exactly are you taking me?" she finally managed to whisper. Her gentle voice shook terribly, betraying her overwhelming fear and confusion. "Home," Arthur replied, his deep, resonant voice vibrating through the cramped carriage. "To the north. To my fortress." Eleanor swallowed hard, her mind racing with 100 different panicked thoughts. "You cannot simply steal a high-born bride from the holy altar, Arthur. The king will send his entire royal army after us for this treason." Arthur actually let out a low, dark chuckle from the shadows. It was a chilling, hollow sound that held absolutely no true humor. "Let the old fool send them," Arthur challenged, leaning forward into the dim lantern light. "I command the entire north, and my fiercely loyal army numbers in the tens of thousands. I would gladly slaughter every single man in the king's guard before I let them touch you." The sheer, casual brutality of his bloody declaration made her gasp aloud. This dangerous man sitting before her was a complete stranger. He was a violent, battle-hardened warlord entirely consumed by his own supreme power. "Why are you doing this to me?" she pleaded, hot tears threatening to spill again. "We have not seen each other in 10 long, agonizing years. You barely even know who I am anymore, Arthur." In a sudden flash of terrifying speed, Arthur moved across the swaying carriage. He did not just sit next to her on the velvet bench. He dropped to one heavily armored knee right between her parted legs. He completely caged her in, trapping her small body against the soft carriage wall. His large, leather-gloved hands gripped her slender thighs through the heavy silk fabric. Eleanor froze completely, her breath catching sharply in her tight throat. "Do not ever say I do not know you," he growled low, his face mere inches from hers. "I know the exact shade of spun gold in your hair when the summer sun hits it. I know the tiny, hidden freckle resting just beneath your left earlobe. I know the musical sound of your laugh, and I know the sweet scent of your skin." He reached up with one hand, impatiently unfastening the heavy steel clasps of his chest plate. With a harsh, forceful tug, he pulled the armor aside, revealing the rough linen tunic beneath. He grabbed her trembling hand and pressed it flat against his broad, muscular chest. He pinned her palm directly over his violently, aggressively beating heart. Beneath the thin fabric, Eleanor felt thick, jagged, horribly raised scars. "I received this lethal wound during the brutal siege of the Red River," he whispered fiercely. "A poisoned enemy spear went straight through my ribs and pierced my lung. The field medics left me face down in the bloody mud to die with the corpses." Eleanor let out a soft, heartbroken sob, her delicate fingers automatically tracing the terrible scar. "Do you know exactly why I did not die that freezing night, Eleanor?" he asked softly. His slate-grey eyes were blazing with a terrifying, absolute, consuming obsession. "Because I remembered the solemn promise you made to me in the meadow. I remembered that you belong entirely to me. I dragged my bleeding body out of that mass grave purely out of raw, stubborn spite. I survived hell out of an unholy, desperate need to come back and claim my rightful bride." Eleanor was entirely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of his dark confession. It was far too heavy, too dark, and too intense for her innocent soul to bear. "Arthur," she whimpered helplessly, feeling the overwhelming heat of his large body surrounding her. "You are truly frightening me." "Good," he stated bluntly, his heated gaze dropping deliberately to her trembling, parted lips. "Honest fear is infinitely safer than the pathetic illusion of safety that old fool was offering you. But you will very quickly learn that I am the only monster you ever need to fear. And I am the only man in this cursed world who will ever protect you." Before her shocked mind could even process his intense words, his large hand slipped to the back of her neck. His strong, calloused fingers tangled deeply into her elaborate, braided wedding hair. He pulled her face down to his, aggressively eliminating the last fraction of distance between them. Arthur kissed her without asking for permission. It was absolutely not the gentle, sweet, innocent kiss of a childhood friend. It was the raw, dominating, breathless kiss of a territorial alpha claiming his chosen mate. It was an absolute, devastating invasion of her senses. His hot mouth was demanding, incredibly possessive, and brutally thorough. He forced her soft lips to part, taking complete, immediate control of her very breath. Eleanor made a tiny, helpless, muffled sound of pure shock deep in the back of her throat. She instinctively tried to push her hands against his impossibly solid, immovable shoulders. But touching his hard muscles only made her acutely aware of how much stronger he truly was. He tasted like expensive dark wine, deep lingering sorrow, and burning, unyielding desire. The searing kiss was meant to punish her, to completely conquer her, and to firmly brand her soul. Yet, hidden underneath the brutal, frightening dominance, there was a desperate, shattering hunger. It was the painful hunger of a starving man finally tasting a glorious feast after a decade of famine. Against her own logical will, a treacherous, undeniable spark of heat ignited deep in Eleanor's belly. Her trembling hands stopped pushing him away and weakly curled into the rough fabric of his tunic. Arthur groaned a deep, animalistic sound in his chest at her tiny, involuntary surrender. He pulled her completely off the velvet seat and directly onto his armored lap. He wrapped his massive, powerful arms around her, crushing her soft curves flush against his hard body. He was firmly marking his territory in a primal way that mere words never could. He was systematically destroying any lingering memory of the miserable life she almost had. When he finally, agonizingly slowly pulled back, they were both gasping heavily for air in the dim light. Eleanor's lips were visibly swollen, bright red, and thoroughly, devastatingly kissed. Her beautiful blue eyes were wide, delightfully dazed, and fully aware of her complete defeat. Arthur gently rested his forehead against hers, his broad chest heaving with heavy breathing. "You are entirely mine now, my sweet little bird," he whispered hoarsely into the dark carriage. "There is absolutely no escaping the freezing cold of the north. And there is certainly no escaping me." The carriage rattled on relentlessly, plunging much deeper into the freezing, endless medieval night. Eleanor slowly closed her eyes, finally resting her exhausted head against the chest of the beast who had saved her. She was undoubtedly his helpless captive. But heaven help her foolish heart, she had never felt more secure in her entire, tragic life. The massive iron gates of the citadel groaned as they swung wide. The sound was like the roar of a dormant mountain beast. Outside the carriage window, the world was a blur of blinding white and jagged grey. The North did not welcome strangers. It only tolerated the strong. The carriage finally came to a heavy, shuddering halt in the central courtyard. Hundreds of elite northern soldiers stood in perfect, silent formation. Their dark armor was coated in a thick layer of glittering frost. Their breath came out in rhythmic plumes of white mist. As the carriage door opened, the freezing mountain air rushed in like a physical blow. Eleanor shivered violently, her thin silk wedding dress offering no protection. Before her feet could even touch the frozen ground, Arthur was there. He didn't wait for her to move. He reached into the carriage and scooped her up with effortless power. He held her high against his massive, fur-lined chest. A low, collective murmur rippled through the ranks of the hardened soldiers. They had never seen their cold, untouchable Duke touch a woman with such fierce care. They had never seen the Alpha of the North look so protective. Arthur ignored his generals and his advisers. He marched straight through the towering arched entrance of the main keep. His heavy boots echoed like thunder against the ancient stone floors. He didn't stop until they reached the great hall, where a massive fire roared in the hearth. The warmth was a sudden, overwhelming contrast to the icy world outside. Arthur finally set Eleanor down on her feet before the dancing flames. But he did not step away. He remained close enough that she was still trapped within his shadow. He looked at her ivory wedding gown with a sudden, dark flash of hatred in his eyes. "This garment is a stain upon my house," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "It belongs to a dead man's memory. It was chosen by a monster who dared to think he could buy you." He signaled to a group of silent, elderly maidservants standing in the shadows. "Remove it," he commanded, his tone brook no argument. Eleanor's eyes widened in sudden alarm. "Arthur, please, it is the only clothing I have." "Not for long," he replied, his gaze raking over her with terrifying intensity. "I will not have you wearing another man's colors under my roof." The maidservants moved forward with practiced, quiet efficiency. They led Eleanor behind a heavy velvet screen near the fireplace. As the silk dress was unlaced and fell to the floor, Eleanor felt a strange sense of liberation. It was as if the weight of Lord Henry's cruelty was finally being stripped away. One of the servants gathered the expensive fabric and stepped toward the hearth. Without a second thought, she threw the ivory gown into the roaring flames. Eleanor watched from behind the screen as her wedding dress turned to black ash. It vanished into the heat, destroyed forever. A moment later, the servants brought her a new garment. It was a gown made of the heaviest, finest midnight blue wool. The sleeves and collar were lined with the softest white fox fur. Embroidered upon the bodice in silver thread was the soaring hawk of Arthur's lineage. It was the mark of the North. It was the mark of the Alpha. When Eleanor stepped out from behind the screen, the breath caught in Arthur's throat. The dark blue color made her pale skin glow like fine porcelain. She looked like a winter queen, beautiful and fragile amidst the stone and steel. Arthur walked toward her, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning. He picked up a heavy, fur-lined cloak, and draped it over her shoulders. His large hands lingered on her collarbone, his thumbs grazing her skin. The heat of his touch was more intense than the fire in the hearth. "Now you look as you were always meant to look," he murmured. "You are no longer a sacrifice for a debt, Eleanor. You are the lady of this fortress. And you are the only soul who holds power over its master." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart thumping a confused, rapid beat. "You talk of power, Arthur, but I am your prisoner. I am behind iron gates and mountain peaks. Arthur leaned down, his face inches from hers, his scent of cedar and cold air enveloping her. A prisoner would be in the dungeons, cold and forgotten, he whispered. You are in my heart, Eleanor. You are in my very blood. The gates are not to keep you in. They are to keep the rest of the world out. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing firmly through hers. His grip was a silent promise of absolute, unshakable possession. The king will come for me, Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. Let him come, Arthur growled, a dangerous smile touching his lips. He will find that the North does not bleed for kings. The North only bleeds for its own. He led her toward the high windows, showing her the vast, snowy empire below. The wind howled against the glass, but inside, the air was still and hot with tension. Eleanor realized then that she was truly lost to her old world. She was a bird in a cage, yes. But the cage was lined with gold and guarded by a god of war. And as Arthur's hand tightened around hers, she felt a terrifying surge of desire. She wanted to hate him for stealing her. But her soul was already beginning to bow to his command. The Alpha had brought her to his den. And he would never, ever let her leave. Night descended upon the iron citadel like a heavy, suffocating velvet curtain. The merciless northern winds hammered furiously against the thick, stained glass windows. Inside the private dining hall, the atmosphere was thick with unbearable, silent tension. A magnificent feast was laid out across the long, battle-scarred oak table. There were rich roasted meats, warm spiced wine, and sweet winter berries. But Eleanor could not bring herself to eat a single, tempting bite. She sat at the right hand of the Duke, her delicate hands trembling nervously in her lap. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his massive presence dominating the entire room. The great hall had been entirely cleared of all servants and armed guards. They were completely, terrifyingly alone in the vast, echoing space. Arthur did not eat either, he only drank deeply from a heavy silver goblet. His slate-grey eyes were dark, unreadable, and intensely focused on her pale face. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 10 years of painful, unspoken words. You must eat something, Eleanor, Arthur finally commanded, his voice a low, warning rumble. You are far too thin, too fragile, and the northern winter is utterly unforgiving. Eleanor looked up abruptly, meeting his intense gaze with a sudden, desperate flare of defiance. How can I possibly eat when my entire world has been destroyed in a single day? You violently stole me from the holy altar, dragged me to the end of the earth, and burned my clothes. And yet, you still expect me to sit here and peacefully dine with you as if nothing has happened. Arthur set his heavy silver goblet down onto the wooden table with a sharp, echoing thud. I did not steal you, my little bird, he corrected her, his tone dangerously, frighteningly calm. I simply retrieved what was always rightfully, eternally mine. Eleanor's breath hitched painfully, her long-repressed frustration finally boiling over the edge of her fear. Then why did you leave me? She cried out, the decade-of-old heartbreak cracking her soft voice. If I was truly yours, why did you abandon me to the wolves 10 long years ago? You promised you would never leave my side, Arthur, but you vanished into the bloody borderlands without a word. The dancing firelight cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across Arthur's rugged, battle-scarred face. For a brief, shocking moment, the ruthless warlord looked genuinely, profoundly pained. He stood up slowly, pushing his heavy wooden chair back with a loud, grating scrape. He walked deliberately around the long table until he was standing directly behind her. Eleanor froze completely, feeling the immense, consuming heat of his large body radiating against her back. He placed his large, calloused hands gently upon her trembling, fragile shoulders. I did not abandon you, Eleanor, he whispered, his deep voice thick with heavily repressed emotion. I traded my own life for yours. Eleanor turned her head slightly, her wide blue eyes swimming with profound, desperate confusion. What do you mean? She breathed softly into the quiet room. Arthur's grip on her shoulders tightened just a fraction, a solid, possessive anchor in the dark. 10 years ago, the corrupt old king cast his greedy, filthy eyes upon your noble house. He wanted your family's fertile lands, and he fully intended to take you as his newest royal plaything. Eleanor gasped loudly, a freezing cold shiver running straight down her spine at the horrifying revelation. I was only a young boy, but I knew I could not protect you from the royal crown while living in the capital. So, I made a secret, bloody pact with the old king's top military generals. I volunteered to personally lead the suicide missions on the frozen, deadly northern borders. I promised them brutal, impossible victories in exchange for your family's absolute, guaranteed safety. Hot tears rapidly welled in Eleanor's eyes as the devastating, heartbreaking truth finally washed over her. He had not broken his innocent childhood promise, he had sacrificed his very soul to keep it. You marched straight into a guaranteed death sentence, just for me, she whispered, her voice breaking completely. I would gladly burn the entire world to ash for you, Arthur replied without a single second of hesitation. He slowly moved to the side of her heavy chair, kneeling down gracefully until he was eye level with her. But you must understand this, Eleanor, I never truly left you. Even when I was buried in blood and freezing mud 1,000 miles away, my eyes were always on you. Eleanor stared down at him, her heart pounding a frantic, chaotic rhythm against her ribs. What are you saying, Arthur? Every shadow in the bright capital belonged entirely to me, he confessed, his eyes burning with a dark, obsessive fire. Every maid who served your meals, every guard who watched your estate, they all reported directly back to me. I knew exactly what time you woke, what poetry books you read, and when you wept silently in the garden. When your poor father fell terribly ill, it was my hidden northern gold that bought the foreign physicians. When those arrogant minor nobles tried to harass you at the summer festival, my assassins ensured they never walked again. Eleanor's mind reeled wildly, struggling to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his lifelong devotion. It was absolute, undeniable madness. It was a level of control and extreme obsession that completely defied all logic and reason. For 10 long years, she thought she was suffering entirely alone, struggling blindly in the dark. But this terrifying, incredibly powerful alpha had been silently orchestrating her entire existence from the shadows. You have been watching me every single day for a decade, she asked, her voice a fragile mix of awe and pure terror. Arthur reached out slowly, his rough thumb gently wiping a fallen, glittering tear from her pale cheek. You were my only guiding light in a decade of endless, bloody darkness, he swore softly, like a prayer. I memorized every single detail of your life to keep myself from completely losing my mind in the slaughter. But watching another man try to claim you from the shadows was slowly, agonizingly killing me, Eleanor. When I learned your bankrupt family had desperately promised you to that vile monster Henry. His strong jaw clenched tightly, a lethal, murderous rage flashing briefly in his storm-gray eyes. I rode my horse for 3 days and 3 nights without sleep just to slaughter anyone who stood between us. He leaned in much closer, his hot, heavy breath brushing intimately against her trembling, parted lips. You are my absolute sanity, my only reward, and my ultimate, consuming obsession. You have never been out of my tight grasp, my sweet little bird. And now that I finally have you safely in my arms, I will never, ever let you go. Eleanor looked deep into the turbulent eyes of the ruthless monster kneeling submissively before her. She saw the raw madness, the terrifying possessiveness, and the violent, absolutely undeniable love. And God help her, her own traitorous heart surrendered completely to his beautiful, twisted darkness. The emotional weight of his dark confession hung heavily in the freezing northern air. Arthur did not say another word as he gently lifted her from the heavy oak chair. He carried her effortlessly through the winding, torchlit corridors of the Iron Citadel. They finally reached the massive, iron-bound doors of the Lord's private bedchamber. The room was enormous, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in thick black furs. A roaring fire cracked loudly in the giant stone hearth, casting wild, dancing shadows across the walls. Arthur carefully set Eleanor down on her feet near the center of the plush, woven rug. But the moment his large hands left her slender waist, a violent shudder tore through his massive frame. The ironclad control he had maintained for 10 agonizing years was rapidly, terrifyingly crumbling. His breathing grew harsh, ragged, and alarmingly uneven in the quiet, firelit room. He backed away from her abruptly, putting an immediate, desperate distance between them. He paced the length of the hard stone floor like a starved, caged predator. His large hands were clenched so tightly into fists that his thick leather gloves creaked under the immense strain. The intense, predatory energy rolling off his powerful body was practically suffocating. "Get into the inner dressing room, Eleanor," Arthur suddenly growled, his voice guttural and deeply strained. He did not even look at her, keeping his burning grey eyes firmly locked on the blank stone wall. "Lock the heavy wooden door behind you and do absolutely not come out until the morning sun rises." Eleanor stood frozen in place, watching the terrifying, physical transformation of the man before her. He was fighting a monstrous, agonizing internal battle against his own darkest, most primal instincts. This was the legendary battle frenzy of the northern warlords, a terrifying myth she had only heard in fearful whispers. It was a state of absolute, pure dominance where the rational man vanished, and only the claiming beast remained. And she was the sole, agonizing trigger for his catastrophic, imminent loss of control. "Arthur, what is happening to you?" she whispered softly, taking a small, hesitant step forward. "Do not step any closer to me," he roared, the sheer, explosive force of his voice shaking the heavy wall tapestries. He slammed his bare, unarmored fist brutally into the solid stone wall to forcibly ground himself in reality. The violent impact left a smearing, dark trail of bright red blood against the unforgiving grey rock. "If you touch me right now, I will absolutely not be able to stop myself," he panted heavily, squeezing his eyes shut in pure agony. "I have starved for you for 3,650 days, Eleanor. If I take you tonight in this feral, uncontrollable state, I will break you. And I would far rather die by my own sword than ever cause you harm." He was practically begging her to save herself from his own monstrous, insatiable hunger. He was completely willing to tear himself entirely apart just to keep her safe from his darkness. Eleanor looked down at his bleeding knuckles and then up at his tormented, heavily scarred face. All of her lingering, deep-seated fear instantly, miraculously evaporated into the warm, scented air. She finally, truly understood the absolute, undeniable depth of his savage, beautiful devotion. He was not a cruel monster who wanted to ruin her innocent life. He was a desperately broken man who worshipped her very existence above his own soul. She did not turn around to flee, and she absolutely did not run toward the locked dressing room. Instead, she took a deep, steadying breath and walked directly toward the pacing, bleeding beast. Arthur's storm-grey eyes snapped wide open as she deliberately closed the dangerous distance between them. His broad, muscular chest heaved violently as he pressed his back hard against the cold stone, trying futilely to retreat from her light. "Eleanor, I command you as your lord to leave this room," he choked out, his voice thick with desperate warning. "You do not command my beating heart, Arthur," she replied softly, her gentle voice remarkably, beautifully steady. She stopped right in front of him, entirely eclipsed by his towering, incredibly intimidating frame. She slowly raised her delicate, trembling white hands and placed them flat against his racing, hammering chest. The intense heat radiating from his large body was absolutely scorching, burning right through his thin linen tunic. Arthur let out a ragged, agonizing groan, his heavy head falling back weakly against the stone wall. He was physically trembling under her impossibly light, deeply forgiving touch. "I am not afraid of you anymore," Eleanor whispered, tilting her beautiful face up to look at his striking jawline. "I am not a fragile glass doll that will shatter apart in your rough hands. I am the woman you bled for, and the woman you conquered the entire bloody world for." She slowly reached up on her tiptoes and gently wiped the cold sweat from his tense, feverish brow. "Do not fight this agony anymore, my absolute alpha," she murmured softly, fully accepting the dominant title he had rightfully earned. "Claim exactly what is yours." The sheer, absolute surrender in her sweet voice was the final, devastating hammer blow to his remaining sanity. The heavy iron chains holding back the starving beast finally, completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. With a raw, deafening growl of pure, unrestrained possession, Arthur lunged forward from the wall. He wrapped his massive, powerful arms around her, lifting her entirely off the ground in a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his handsome face deeply into the soft, fragrant crook of her delicate neck. He inhaled her sweet, intoxicating scent like a dying man taking his very first, desperate breath of pure oxygen. His hot, seeking mouth crashed down onto hers with a devastating, world-ending, unquenchable hunger. It was a deeply consuming kiss of fire, blood, and her entire decade of agonizing, unspoken desperation finally released. Eleanor wrapped her arms tightly around his broad neck, meeting his terrifying, beautiful passion with her own blossoming fire. She completely, willingly surrendered to the overwhelming, inescapable storm of the dark north. She knew there was absolutely no going back to her old life now, and she absolutely did not want to. The captive bird had finally, happily embraced her glorious, terrifying, eternal cage. The pale morning light struggled to pierce the thick, frost-covered windows of the master bedchamber. Inside the massive, fire-warmed room, a profound, heavy silence had finally replaced the violent storm of the night. Eleanor woke slowly, wrapped entirely in the suffocating warmth of thick, black wolf furs. She felt a heavy, immovable weight resting securely across her bare waist. Arthur's massive, heavily scarred arm was draped over her, pinning her safely against his hard, incredibly warm chest. Even in his deep, exhausted sleep, the warlord held her strictly like a dragon hoarding its most precious treasure. She turned her head slightly, her messy golden hair spilling beautifully across his heavily muscled shoulder. She studied his rugged, handsome face in the soft, revealing grey morning light. The terrifying, feral beast from last night was completely, miraculously gone. In his place was a man who looked utterly, peacefully ruined by his own immense, unwavering devotion. Every single lingering trace of her miserable past life had been thoroughly, completely erased from her body and soul. She belonged strictly to the Duke of the North now, completely, fiercely, and irrevocably. Arthur's dark eyelashes suddenly fluttered open, his storm-grey eyes instantly alert and terrifyingly sharp. But the exact moment his gaze locked onto her delicate face, the lethal sharpness melted into pure, liquid heat. "Good morning, my sweet bird," he murmured, his deep morning voice a low, vibrating rumble against her spine. He gently brushed a tangled curl from her forehead with a surprising, heartbreaking tenderness. His rough, calloused thumb carefully traced the faint, reddish marks his desperate kisses had left upon her pale collarbone. A sudden, dark shadow of deep regret briefly crossed his striking, dangerous features. "I was far too rough with you," he whispered, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to her temple. "I swore I would never hurt you, and yet I allowed the starving madness to take complete control." Eleanor smiled softly, raising her delicate hand to gently cup his rough, stubbled cheek. "You did not hurt me, Arthur," she assured him firmly, her voice clear and completely devoid of any lingering fear. "You simply made me yours, exactly as you were always meant to do." Arthur closed his eyes heavily, leaning desperately into her gentle touch like a starving man finding absolute salvation. You are my true, absolute queen, he vowed solemnly, pressing his warm lips passionately against her soft palm. And I will spend every single day of the rest of my miserable life proving my eternal loyalty to you. Before Eleanor could properly respond to his beautiful, heavy vow, a sharp, urgent knock echoed rapidly through the chamber. The heavy oak door rattled slightly under the forceful, panicked pounding from the stone corridor. Arthur's peaceful expression instantly hardened, the ruthless, terrifying alpha returning in a split second. He carefully pulled the heavy furs up to Eleanor's chin, ensuring she was completely hidden from the world's view. "Speak," Arthur commanded loudly, his voice echoing like rolling thunder across the vast, shadowed room. A muffled, highly anxious voice called out desperately from the cold stone hallway outside. "My Lord Duke, I beg your immediate, absolute forgiveness for this morning intrusion. A massive royal envoy has just arrived at the southern iron gates of the citadel. They bear the king's personal royal seal, and they demand an immediate, formal audience with you." Eleanor's blood instantly ran freezing cold, a sharp spike of pure terror piercing her newfound, fragile happiness. The greedy king had not wasted a single second in coming aggressively after his stolen prize. "They have brought 5,000 heavily armed royal knights with them, my lord," the guard shouted through the wood. "They demand the immediate return of Lady Eleanor, or they threaten to lay full siege to the fortress." Eleanor gasped loudly, her small hands tightly gripping the edges of the dark animal furs. 5,000 brutal men had marched relentlessly across the frozen wasteland just to drag her back to hell. Arthur did not look the least bit surprised, nor did he look remotely intimidated by the massive threat. A slow, incredibly dangerous, almost joyful smile spread slowly across his ruggedly handsome face. He casually threw back the heavy covers and rose from the bed like a dark, vengeful god of war. He did not bother to cover his heavily scarred, magnificently muscled body as he walked directly toward his armor stand. "Tell the arrogant royal envoy to wait in the great, freezing lower courtyard," Arthur ordered calmly over his shoulder. "Tell them I will be down shortly to give them my absolute, final, and bloody answer." "Yes, my lord," the guard shouted back, his heavy iron boots quickly retreating down the stone hallway. Eleanor sat up quickly in the bed, pulling the furs tightly around her trembling, naked shoulders. "Arthur, 5,000 men," she whispered, her voice shaking with genuine, desperate fear for his precious life. "The king will legally declare you a traitor to the crown and immediately demand your public execution." Arthur calmly strapped his heavy leather weapons belt around his waist, his movements slow, deliberate, and utterly unbothered. He walked back to the massive bed and leaned heavily over her, bracing his large hands on the soft mattress. "Let him declare whatever foolishness he wishes, my frightened little bird," he murmured, aggressively kissing her trembling lips. 5,000 soft, privileged southern knights will freeze to absolute death before they ever breach my outer walls." He reached out and gently pulled her up against his hard, incredibly warm chest. "You are absolutely not going to hide in this dark room while they arrogantly demand your return, Eleanor. You are going to dress in the finest, heaviest northern furs my fortress has to offer. You are going to walk out onto that high stone balcony with me, holding my hand firmly for the entire world to see. I want the king's pathetic envoy to look up and see exactly whose bed you belong in. I want them to know that to take you, they will first have to wade through a massive river of their own blood." Eleanor looked deep into his fierce, unyielding grey eyes and felt a sudden, massive surge of profound northern courage. She was no longer the helpless, desperate little girl crying helplessly at the altar of a ruined cathedral. She was the chosen mate of the most dangerous, unconditionally powerful man in the entire kingdom. "I will stand proudly right beside you," she promised fiercely, her blue eyes blazing with a newfound, terrifying fire. Arthur grinned broadly, a feral, beautiful expression of absolute pride and terrifying possessiveness. "Then let us go graciously show the foolish king what actually happens when he tries to steal from a starving wolf." The bitter northern wind whipped viciously across the high stone balcony. Eleanor stood tall, wrapped entirely in the magnificent midnight blue furs of the Duke. Arthur stood right beside her, an imposing mountain of dark steel and lethal intent. He held her small hand tightly, his grip a public claim of absolute ownership. Below them, the frozen courtyard was packed with 5,000 royal knights. Their golden armor looked ridiculously fragile against the harsh northern ice. The king's arrogant envoy sat on a white horse, holding a royal decree. "Lord Arthur, you have committed high treason," the envoy shouted loudly. "The king demands you surrender Lady Eleanor immediately." A deafening, highly tense silence instantly fell over the massive fortress. Arthur simply let out a dark laugh that echoed terrifyingly off the jagged peaks. "You bring soft boys to my frozen gates and dare to make demands?" Arthur mocked. He casually raised Eleanor's hand to his lips and kissed it for the army to see. "Tell your pathetic king that I have already claimed my rightful mate. She is the Lady of the North, and she will never return to that rotting capital." The royal envoy's face turned bright red with intense, foolish rage. "This is an open declaration of war," the envoy screamed in sheer panic. Arthur's cold smile vanished, replaced by the merciless glare of a predator. He reached behind his cape and calmly drew a massive black iron longbow. Without a word, he narked a heavy, steel-tipped arrow onto the thick string. He drew it back effortlessly, a terrifying feat of monstrous strength. The string snapped forward with a deafening crack that split the freezing air. The black arrow flew across the vast courtyard with blinding speed. It shattered the wooden pole of the royal banner right beside the envoy's head. The heavy golden flag crashed violently into the frozen, muddy ground. The horse reared up in absolute terror, throwing the screaming envoy to the ice. "That was your only warning," Arthur boomed like the wrath of a dark god. "Take your trembling boys south before I feed you to my winter wolves. If any man steps toward my wife, I will mount his head on these iron gates." The 5,000 knights collectively stepped back in pure, unadulterated fear. Eleanor looked up at the terrifying man, her heart swelling with deep pride. He had just openly defied the entire kingdom simply to keep her safe. She squeezed his hand, vowing to stand by her alpha until the end of the world. The 5,000 royal knights fled like frightened sheep into the howling snowstorm. The heavy iron gates of the citadel slammed shut with a final, echoing boom. Arthur stood unmoving on the high balcony until the very last golden banner disappeared from sight. He did not lower his massive iron bow until his territory was completely, absolutely secure. Then, the terrifying warlord finally turned his attention entirely back to his brave bride. The aggressive adrenaline of the bloody standoff began to fade into the freezing air. It left behind a heavy, fiercely protective tension that radiated from his massive frame. He looked down at Eleanor, his storm-grey eyes scanning her face for any lingering signs of fear. "Did my violence frighten you, my sweet bird?" he asked softly against the bitter wind. Eleanor did not hesitate for a single, fleeting fraction of a second. She reached up and gently placed her warm hands on his cold, armored cheeks. "You did exactly what a true king of the North must do to protect his own," she answered proudly. A profound, shattering relief instantly washed over Arthur's harsh, battle-scarred features. He scooped her effortlessly into his strong arms, shielding her completely from the biting cold. He carried her away from the frozen walls and back into the deep, burning warmth of his private sanctuary. The massive oak doors of their bedchamber closed securely, completely sealing out the rest of the dangerous world. The roaring fire in the grand stone hearth bathed the large room in a soft, golden glow. Arthur carefully set her down on her feet upon the thick, beautifully woven rug. He slowly unbuckled his heavy leather weapons belt and let it drop heavily to the stone floor. He looked at her not as a ruthless conqueror, but as a man entirely at the mercy of his greatest love. "I have spent 10 long years preparing for a massive war just to keep you safe," he confessed quietly. But I never dared to actually dream that you would willingly choose to stay with me. Eleanor took a step closer, slowly untying the heavy ribbons of her magnificent midnight blue cloak. The luxurious fox fur fell softly to the stone floor, pulling elegantly around her delicate feet. She reached out and took his large, heavily calloused hands in her own small ones. I spent 10 years surviving in a golden cage, completely hollow and terrified, she whispered fiercely. I thought the sweet, gentle boy who made me daisy crowns had died in the northern snow. But he did not die, he simply became the magnificent, powerful beast I needed to survive. She pressed a soft, deeply reverent kiss to the center of his heavily scarred right palm. You are my absolute alpha, my fierce protector, and my only true home, Arthur. There is absolutely no other place in this entire world where I truly belong. Arthur let out a ragged, desperate breath, pulling her flush against his broad, muscular chest. He buried his handsome face in her golden hair, his massive frame trembling slightly with overwhelming emotion. This was the absolute, final victory he had desperately craved far more than any military conquest. His beautiful, unbroken queen had finally accepted both his monstrous darkness and his blinding light. He gently tipped her chin up, his dark gaze burning with a slow, passionate, eternal fire. Then let me properly worship the true queen of the north, he murmured warmly against her lips. He kissed her with a slow, devastating tenderness that was infinitely more powerful than his rage. It was a kiss that completely healed a decade of agonizing scars and broken childhood promises. Eleanor wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, sinking entirely into the infinite depths of his love. She knew that the arrogant old king might eventually send more foolish men to their frozen borders. She knew that the cruel world outside would always try to violently tear their happiness apart. But none of those distant threats mattered to her anymore in the absolute safety of his strong arms. She was guarded by the most ruthless, hopelessly devoted predator the kingdom had ever known. He would gladly burn 100 enemy cities to ash before he ever let a single tear fall from her eyes. Arthur swept her gracefully up into his arms again, carrying her toward the massive, fur-lined bed. He laid her down incredibly gently, treating her like the most sacred, precious relic in existence. He worshipped every single inch of her soft skin with a slow, consuming, desperate reverence. Every intimate touch was a silent vow of eternal protection, and every kiss was a promise of unbreakable devotion. Eleanor sighed happily, fully surrendering her soul to the magnificent monster who loved her entirely. The captive bird had finally found her true wings in the heart of the freezing north. And the Alpha had finally found the only beautiful soul capable of taming his wild, bleeding heart. 5 long, incredibly prosperous years had passed since the massive royal army fled in absolute terror from the frozen gates of the north. The formidable iron citadel was no longer just a terrifying, bloody fortress of war and endless, freezing shadows. It had beautifully blossomed into the wealthiest, most powerful, and undeniably safest sanctuary in the entire kingdom. The corrupt, arrogant old king had died a miserable, highly paranoid death 2 years ago. He had spent his final days constantly looking over his shoulder, utterly terrified of Arthur's inevitable northern vengeance. His young, cowardly successor now respectfully sent massive chests of heavy gold as annual tribute just to keep the peace. Absolutely no one in the known world would ever dare to threaten the mighty Duke of the North or his beloved bride again. The imposing black banners of the Northern Hawk now flew proudly alongside the delicate golden lilies of Eleanor's noble house. Arthur had strictly demanded her family's beautiful crest be permanently intertwined with his own as a public symbol of absolute equality. Every single detail of the mighty fortress had been carefully, lovingly redesigned to bring her absolute comfort and boundless joy. He had built her a magnificent, towering library filled with thousands of rare books imported from across the distant seas. He had even constructed a massive glass greenhouse so she could cultivate her favorite summer blooms in the dead of winter. Eleanor stood peacefully on the high, sunlit balcony overlooking the breathtaking, snow-covered courtyard. She was wrapped warmly in a magnificent cloak of pure white fox fur, a delicate crown of winter roses resting in her golden hair. Her gentle, pale hands rested lovingly upon the pronounced, beautiful curve of her swollen belly. She was proudly carrying their third child, a living, physical testament to a love that had violently defied the entire world. Down below, in the safe, enclosed royal garden, a scene of impossible, heartwarming joy was beautifully unfolding. Arthur, the legendary, bloodthirsty warlord who once made entire empires tremble in sheer terror, was currently on his knees in the soft snow. He was gently holding their highly energetic 3-year-old son, proudly teaching the brave little boy how to properly hold a tiny wooden sword. Their beautiful, golden-haired 2-year-old daughter was giggling uncontrollably as she rode securely upon his broad, incredibly strong shoulders. The massive, terrifying alpha of the realm was completely, utterly, and happily defeated by his own precious, tiny children. Eleanor smiled radiantly, her warm heart overflowing with a profound, peaceful happiness she had once thought impossible to ever achieve. Arthur suddenly paused his joyful, playful game, his incredibly sharp, predatory instincts instantly sensing her adoring gaze from high above. He looked up, and his storm-grey eyes locked intensely onto hers with the exact same, burning, obsessive devotion as the day he ruthlessly stole her. He carefully handed the laughing children over to their fiercely loyal northern nurses and strode purposely toward the stone stairs. A few short moments later, he stepped out onto the sunlit balcony, his massive, comforting presence instantly warming the crisp winter air. He wrapped his strong, heavily scarred arms carefully around her delicate waist from behind, resting his rough chin lovingly on her soft shoulder. His large, calloused hands gently covered hers over the precious, rapidly growing life safely protected inside her womb. "You should absolutely not be standing out in the cold wind for so long, my incredibly beautiful queen," he murmured softly into her sensitive ear. "The northern winter sun is remarkably warm today, my fierce love," Eleanor replied, leaning happily back into his solid, immovable strength. "And I was simply enjoying the glorious, highly amusing sight of the most dangerous man in the kingdom playing in the snow." Arthur chuckled low and deep in his massive chest, a rich, wonderful sound that was exclusively reserved only for her ears. "I would gladly play the humble, foolish court jester every single day of my long life if it brings that breathtaking smile to your perfect face." He gently turned her around in his powerful arms, his intense, adoring gaze sweeping reverently over her glowing, flawless features. "I look at you right now, and I honestly still cannot fully believe that you actually, truly belong to me," he confessed, his deep voice thick with raw emotion. Eleanor reached up without hesitation, her soft fingers lovingly tracing the faded, heroic scar resting just above his left eyebrow. "I have always belonged entirely to you, Arthur, long before you ever violently broke down those heavy cathedral doors. And I will faithfully continue to belong to you until the very last stars finally fall from the midnight sky." Arthur leaned down slowly, capturing her soft lips in a deep, searingly passionate kiss that tasted heavily of absolute forever. It was no longer a brutal kiss born of desperate, starving hunger or agonizing, deeply fearful obsession. It was the triumphant, profoundly secure kiss of a powerful king who had fought absolute hell and finally, permanently won his beautiful heaven. Down in the snowy courtyard, their precious children laughed loudly, their joyous voices echoing beautifully across the silent, protective mountains. The dark, highly traumatic shadows of their painful, separated past had been thoroughly, completely eradicated by the blinding, brilliant light of their future. The entire world knew the absolute, unbreakable, eternal law of the frozen, unconquerable North. The ruthless warlord had successfully claimed his chosen mate, built his legendary dynasty, and violently secured their eternal, undeniable happiness. They were the ultimate, undisputed masters of their own epic destiny, tightly bound together by a love far stronger than the sharpest steel. And in the warm, fiercely protective embrace of her devoted Alpha, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, completely home.